Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Good evening. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, thanks for having me on today.
Yes, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be part of the Wasp Museum.
Yes. So I grew up in this area and moved away to the Dallas area actually for about 20 years. And we came back here about 3 years ago for my husband's job. And we'd never lived in Sweetwater before. But one of the first things we checked out was the Wasp Museum. And I was shocked because I have a background in business and marketing, but then I also have a master's degree in education. And I taught history. I taught about the Tuskegee Airmen, the Navajo Code Talkers. Never had I talked about the WASP because I didn't know about them. So loved the museum. I just became enamored with these women and started volunteering. And then this position came open and just my background just kind of fell in line with what they were looking for. And so I've been here 2 years now. I have lost you.
Oh, if I push the right button, it'll work.
Yes.
Let's go back to the beginning and bring us up to date on the WASP program itself, how it got started and what it was all about.
Well, that would be my pleasure. I brought some pictures with me tonight. So this is just one view of our museum. It opened its doors in 2005 in a hangar that was built in 1929. This had actually served as the first municipal airport for the city of Sweetwater, and it sits about a mile south of Avenger Field where the ladies trained. And of course, you already read our mission statement. So, we do preserve the legacy, the story and the legacy of the WASP. But I'm going to jet on over that. But I would like to kind of take you back in time and tell that story about these women who forever changed how flight looks like today. So the use of women in the military is one of the best kept secrets of World War II. When the training program began, it was secretive because so many people doubted that women could really cut it, right? But the WASP proved the naysayers wrong, and they proved that women could fly wingtip to wingtip with male pilots. After the first successful flight by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903, flight became mostly something that men did. It wasn't even until 1911 that Harriet Quimby became the first woman to get her license and fly. But after her, so many women began taking flying lessons, and by 1929, there was an organization called the 99s that began. And it was called that because they had 99 female charter members, all pilots, with a couple of really famous aviators that you've probably heard of, such as Amelia Earhart and Jacqueline Cochran. Now, this story, like any good story, is going to have some main characters, and Jacqueline Cochran was certainly one of those major players. In 1941, as World War II began to escalate, Jacqueline really recommended military aircraft flight training for women. She escalated that idea with General Hap Arnold and also with the Roosevelts, President Roosevelt and his wife. But her idea was rejected. So in the spring of 1942, Hap Arnold actually suggested that she take a group of women, she took 28 of them, to England to ferry airplanes there. So they went and they joined the British Air Transport Auxiliary, which was affectionately called the ATA Gals or the ATA Gals. Soon after those pilots went to England, the United States realized that there was just a great shortage of trained male pilots to carry out all those duties needed for the war effort. And at the time, Eleanor, of course, she had heard the talk about women joining. She had heard those presentations given by Jacqueline Cochran, so she was well aware. She had a newspaper column at the time, and so she boldly wrote one day in one of her columns, she wrote, "It is time to put in the girls. This is not a time when women should be patient. We are in war and we need to fight it with all our ability and every weapon possible. women pilots, in this particular case, are a secret weapon waiting to be used. And it was shortly after that bold statement that women did, in fact, start entering the war as civil servants. So Nancy Harkness Love was an experienced pilot. She actually received her pilot's license in 1930 at the age of 16. But in early 1942, she took a position as an administrative assistant to Colonel William Tunner, who was commander of the Air Transport Command. And he was in dire need of more pilots, and he didn't even know Nancy was a pilot. In fact, she was living in Washington, and she commuted to Delaware every day, and she flew in her own plane to get there because it was cheaper and easier to get airplane fuel than it was car fuel. So he one day was lamenting to a man named Bob, who just happened to be Nancy's husband, about needing more pilots. And Bob said, well, why don't you ask Nancy? And there she had been under his nose the whole time. So they had a conversation about it, and she convinced him that women could enter strictly to ferry airplanes and free men to go and fight. So they were created as the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, and they were known as the Wasps. She recruited 28, and they are known as the Originals. These women were highly trained with over 500 hours of flight time when they came in. In September of that year, the Wasps began flying at Newcastle Army Airfield, Wilmington, Delaware. By June 1943, Nancy was commanding 4 squadrons, which included Love Field, Texas, also Newcastle, Delaware, Romulus, Michigan, and Long Beach, California. So Nancy never had any kind of thought of a separate division for women. She just quietly wanted to get the women in alongside the men. So in September of 1942, General Hap Arnold finally approved of the program to train women to fly military aircraft. And he was the one that formed, Nancy's experimental squadron of the Air Transport Command. And so he set that into motion, right? Well, when he did that, Jackie Cochran, we'll back up to her, who was far across the ocean, heard about it, and she was angry because she had been promised that that program would belong to her. And so she quickly came home and confronted General Arnold about his decision. So he quickly reversed a little bit, and he expanded flying opportunities for female pilots, and he sanctioned the creation of the Women's Flying Training Detachment, which was known as the WFTD, and Jacqueline Cochran headed up that part of it. And then in 1943, the WAFs and the WFTD merged to create the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASP. So Jackie Cochran was director of the program, and then Nancy Love was head of the ferrying division, and that's the way it was carried out from that point on. Cochran's objective was really to see if women could serve as military pilots, to release the men for combat flying, and to decrease the Air Force's total demand on the manpower pool. Like I said, it was a civil service program. They were never militarized. 25,000 women applied, but only about 3,000 of them actually had pilot's licenses. And then of that 3,000, 1,830 were accepted. They were the ones that met the criteria. And in less than 2 years under Jackie Cochran's command and Nancy Love's command, 1,102 WASP flew over 60 million miles in every type of aircraft owned by the Air Force Army arsenal. So there were some tight requirements for these ladies. They had to be American citizens, at least 21 years old, although that was later brought down to 18, high school diploma, minimum height of 60 inches, which would later actually change to 64 inches. Initially, they had to have a commercial pilot's license, although that later was just changed to a general pilot's license. The first group had 500 hours of logged flying time. That went down to 200 and then down to 35 toward the end of the war. They wanted them to have cross-country experience and pass a physical from the surgeon and interview with an authorized recruiting officer. It's been documented that Jackie really did most of those interviews. All right, so here we have one of the reasons that the height requirement was changed from 60 to 64 inches was because so many of the women were just too short to see. And that's a deep airplane. If you've ever been in a BT, especially a BT-13, even the men have to kind of look side to side. But anyway, the women were truly at a disadvantage. And so they would take, you see the parachute pack in the picture, they would take those and they would stack them to help them see out, right? So this is a picture of Wasp Mildred Davidson Dalrymple, and she bragged about being a 3-cushion pilot. The program actually started in Houston. The first class came through in 1943. They started in 1942, November 16th of 1942. They started at the Howard Hughes Municipal Airport, and that's where they learned to fly the Army Way. The second class arrived in December of 42, and then another group each month after. But by the time the third class came, the conditions in Houston were just overcrowded, and it made it dangerous. And Jackie knew she was going to be expanding that program. The first goal was to get it up to 750 women, then 1,000 women, and then just under 2,000. So she knew that there needed to be a better, more self-contained place for them. So with the help of her assistant, Dee Dee Deaton, they found Avenger Field in Sweetwater. It was being used for the British Royal Air Force, but they knew that program was going to be phased out, and so they got permission to move the ladies there. It was much better circumstances for them. It was a complete Army airfield with barracks and classrooms and everything that they would need. So it was a great step up for them. For the first 2 weeks, it was co-ed. And then as the men were phased out, they left. And then Jacqueline declared it a women trainees field only. And so the girls that were training there laughingly named it Cochran's Convent. But in reality, the program was so tenuous, and Jacqueline did not want to give anyone anything to talk about. So she felt like the ladies might make better choices if there were no men involved. And this is Fifanella, who was a little female gremlin, and she was created by Walt Disney. The Wasp wrote to him and asked for permission to use her as a mascot, and it was granted. And so Fifanella has been associated with the Wasp ever since. They sewed their own patches, the Wasp did, that is. Some of them were made out of leather or cloth, and they would put it on their flight jackets, on their zoot suits. And she was the one that watched over them. Now, when the program had to move from Houston to Avenger Field, those airplanes had to be flown over. So when they made that mass transition, right, in 1943, the locals turned out to watch the arrival of these women, right? And they were very curious to see. They really somewhere in their heads believed that women wouldn't be flying. They really thought that there'd be a male pilot bringing the women over. But the Wasp trainees successfully piloted their planes that whole 350 miles cross country from Howard Hughes to Avenger Field. Every plane landed on time and was piloted by a female. Now, some of these locals who gathered to watch their arrival, they were looking forward to seeing some tall, curvaceous, beautiful women emerge from the airplanes. Well, when the girls emerged, most of them were indeed stately and tall and beautiful, but no one would ever have known it. There was nothing sexy about their baggy flight suits, which they called zoot suits, further distorted by the unsexiest of all possible appendages, which was that seat pack parachute that we were talking about earlier. In general, what the locals saw was some exhausted individuals whose sex was almost indiscernible. And there began the adventure and the history in Sweetwater. The families initially didn't embrace the WASP. Again, it was met, the whole program was met with a lot of suspicion. But over time, as the newspaper wrote articles and as Jackie Cochran would come visit town, families really began to embrace these young women. And they would invite them to Sunday church, as was the custom, to their homes for dinners. They'd take them on outings. One woman who sits on our board, she was a little bitty girl, and her father was an instructor at the base, and he occasionally would bring one of the WASP home and let him spend the night and actually get to soak in a tub and play with Sandra and her little sisters and just give them a taste of the home that they were missing. Let's see. So this was because it was a civil service program. The girls were required to pay their way to get to Sweetwater. And if they washed out, they had to pay their way home. Room and board was deducted from their paychecks at $1.65 a day. Their paychecks were $174.50 a month. And then they also had to pay for their uniforms out of that, which were not requirements that the men had. The ladies were kept really busy, pretty much sun up to sundown. There's a lot of accounts of them falling dead asleep at the end of the day, but they did build in some time on weekends where they could occasionally go and have fun. They would go to the Sweetwater municipal swimming pool, out to the lake. Some of them enjoyed a little water skiing and golfing and movies at the Texas Theater. Some of the local ranchers also held ranch rodeos so that their cowboys could show off their skills. And of course, here you see a picture of one of the Wasps getting on, and they would let the ladies get on. And some of the girls who were from like back east would show up in outlandish, cowboy costumes, thinking that that's how they were going to fit in with their big chaps and spurs. And so it was fun. They tried really hard to fit in. About 700 local people worked at Avenger Field in a lot of different capacities. So you had flight instructors, there were ground school instructors, your medical personnel, custodians, cooks, guards, tower operators, and mechanics. Our collections manager, her mother was actually one of 2 female mechanics at Avenger Field, and she was responsible for the maintenance and inspections of all the planes that the WASP trained on. We asked her one time, how did you get into mechanics? How did you get into that field? She's still living. She's 100 years old. And she laughed at us and said, well, there weren't men around to do it, so I got to do it. So Avenger Field was the only base, it was the only WASP base, and the training was conducted just on our base. It was an all-through school, so they didn't move from base to base through training. They were here 6 to 7 months, depending on weather. Their training was 30 weeks of curriculum, which included 393 hours of ground school and 210 hours of flight instruction. So their ground school included classes in meteorology, navigation, mathematics, physics, mechanics. And then they also spent 50 hours in a link trainer as well, which is just a 1940s simulator. They actually had an entire room full of these link trainers that ran all day long. Physical fitness was also incredibly important. They had to have good upper body strength. For those of you out there who are pilots, especially those of you who've flown Warbirds, you know it takes a little more muscle than today's planes. So they spent hours doing calisthenics, and they also marched everywhere they went, and they always sang while they did their calisthenics, and they sang while they marched. So they trained on 5 airplanes while they were here. They started out on primary trainers. So this is the PT-17 and the PT-19, and they had to accrue 70 hours of flying time in each plane. And once they passed primary training, they would go to basic training in a BT-13, where they would have to complete another 70 hours of flying instruction. And then they would move on to the AT6, which is the advanced trainer at advanced trainer 6. Well, I'm stumbling over my words, the AT6, and the UC-78. They needed 50 hours of flying time in the AT6 and then only 20 in the UC-78. So after each phase of flight training, they would have to pass a check ride with with an Army pilot. And if they passed, they went on to the next level. If they didn't, they went home. And when they washed out, they went straight back to their bunks. They packed up on the spot, stripped their sheets, and walked out. So when their bunkmates would come back at the end of the day, they would see that stripped bed, and they would know, okay, my friend washed out. There was never an opportunity to say goodbye or have any kind of closure. And this is what they affectionately called as the wishing well. And trainees threw coins in that well for good luck before they soloed or had a test flight. Many trainees remember being thrown in that well, as you see here. It was a kind of a ritual for when they successfully soloed, they'd get pitched in the well. This wishing well is the only part of Avenger Field that is still in the same location today. So graduation was always a big affair. As you can see here, they would have a great ceremony where they would receive those coveted silver wings, and then they would receive their assignment. They went to over 120 duty bases all over the US. Most of them, about 300 of them, would go on to ferry pilots, to ferry airplanes. And they would do that under, of course, Nancy Love. And then many of them would go on to tow targets for gunnery practice. So this was always what I thought seemed like a dangerous mission. The women would attach those targets that flew about 1,000 feet behind the plane, and the men would aim their guns at that target, and the goal was to hit the target. They did it from the ground and air to air as well. And there are definitely stories of women. In fact, I spoke with a kid of a Wasp last year, and he said this was his mother's assignment, and her plane was hit 4 times, but thankfully nothing deadly. But these ladies were based mostly in Camp Davis, North Carolina, Harlingen, Texas, and Las Vegas. So when men tell their war stories, they usually talk about the plane that they flew. And but the Wasp had to learn how to fly all the planes because they never knew from one day to the next what plane they might be flying. So before that program ended, the Wasp had flown in 77 different types of airplanes. So, and also, I know I'm backing up, but they did more missions than ferrying and tow targets. They did night maneuvers, they simulated strafing, and they ferried personnel from time to time, just anything that kept them in from having to be stateside so that they could go fly combat. So this is one of my favorite stories. You may have heard it before. It's concerning the B-29, the Super Fortress. This was a plane that, of course, the U.S. badly needed to end the war. And Colonel Paul Tibbets, who's pictured here in the middle, he was assigned what proved to be a pretty daunting task of training those Army pilots to fly this plane. Tibbets handpicked these men, and they started refusing to fly the plane, calling it a widowmaker. It had sort of a nasty habit of the engine catching on fire, and they were very concerned. Tibbets actually made a call to Boeing, the maker of the airplane, and spoke with them about it. And they said, look, if you follow the directions, it will not catch fire. So he decided that he would make an example of the men by finding 2 Wasp to train and learn how to fly the plane. And so he showed up to Eglin Air Force Base one day unannounced, and he looked and saw that there were 2 Wasp on the field and really picked them almost at random. He picked Dee Dee Dorman and Dora Doherty, and they had this short conversation, and he decided that they'd be a great fit to learn how to fly this. He trained them how to do it in 3 days. And even during that 3 days, Dora experienced a little small engine fire, but she followed directions. She was able to quickly put it out and land that plane. So with the training complete, he started having them fly it to different airfields. And the men would go out there and they'd be really excited to see that plane come down and land. They'd go out to the flight line and out would come 2 women. And they were appalled. So appalled that eventually Colonel Tippis was asked from those powers above that he had made his point, please stop taking the B-29 and the women around. And of course, there was no trouble getting them into flight after that. And the B-29 went on to play a very decisive role in the Allied victory in World War II, thanks in part to 2 skilled Wasp pilots. One of the assignments that was also somewhat of a secret mission was ferrying airplanes to Great Falls, Montana, to be delivered to the Russians. So the USSR had lost most of its airplanes because of the German bombing early in the war. And so as part of the Land-Lease Agreement, the United States delivered over 8,000 planes to the Russians during the course of the war. And our Wasp would fly them to Great Falls, where they would be taken on by men after that. A common misconception is that these Wasps were able to fly outside of the U.S., and they were not. They were confined to the boundaries. They could go as far as Canada. There's been stories about them pushing planes over that Canadian border, but they did not leave the United States. At least it hasn't been documented. If you've ever Googled WASP, right, Women Air Force Service Pilots, this picture has probably come up. By fall of 1943, the rapid production of the Army's pursuit planes made it essential that more WASP join the ferrying effort. These women were flying the most sophisticated aircraft in our inventory. And some of these planes actually had the first radar ever used. And because of that, these women were trained to use firearms and they were issued Colt 45s. So their instruction was to shoot that plane in order to destroy the equipment if they ever thought that it could fall into enemy's hands. So these were the very first 4 ever trained, and there was a photographer there to kind of catch that euphoric moment for them. If the Wasps were killed during service, and 38 of them were, the government did not pay to have their bodies shipped home. They had to take up a collection from their fellow Wasp so that they could send that body home and they also sent a Wasp escort to go with her. It's been documented that Jacqueline Cochran often gave a lot of her own money to make that happen. And this is just all the women who lost their lives. Some of them were killed in training accidents, but most of them were killed out in actual service. In October of 1944, the war was winding down. Some of the men were starting to come home, and there wasn't as great a need for the women. In fact, if the women stayed in that situation, some men would just simply be out of work. And like today, it caused a big media firestorm, and the newspapers, kept escalating the issue of why would we spend all this money to train women if there were men there ready to come and take those jobs back. And so General Arnold made the decision to deactivate the program, and he informed Jackie of his intention. I was visiting with Wasp Shirley Cruz. She's 99 this summer, and she was sent back during that last class of 1944. She was already activated out in her field, but she was sent back for instrument training, and she was so excited to be getting the extra training and moving on to bigger planes and bigger things. And she got a rude shock when Jackie Cochran showed up, and she came out to all the women. They were out there on that flight line, standing in their uniforms. And she said, "I'm sorry, the program has been deactivated." And, Shirley still remembers it like it was yesterday. And she said, we'd been told for 2 years we'd be military. And it was just so shocking to just see that go away. This was a picture of the last graduating class at Avenger Field. A lot of dignitaries came to this graduation, including Hap Arnold. And he spoke at their graduation, and this is what he said to the ladies. He said, "In the beginning, I had my doubts that a slip of a young girl could fight the controls of a BT-17 in the heavy weather they would naturally encounter in operational flying. However, you and 900 of your sisters have shown that you can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. If there ever was a doubt in anyone's mind that a woman can be a skillful pilot, the Wasp have dispelled that doubt. We will never forget what you have done." But they did forget. When the program was deactivated, the Army Air Force sealed their records. And most of the Wasps went home. They married, they had children, they settled in to raise them, and life went on. Some of them went to work. None of them were allowed to be pilots. Some of them worked for aircraft companies and administration. Some of them worked as stewardesses for commercial airlines. But that was it. And notably, you know, like their male counterparts, right? Most World War II veterans are hesitant to talk about their war experiences, and the same can be said about the Wasp. And I have met so many of their families who said, "Oh man, we had no idea Mom even did this, you know, until we were grown and out of the house." But one thing that got the women talking about their service was that in 1972, women were going to be admitted to the military academies for the first time, according to the government. Well, the Wasp knew that they had served, maybe not officially in the military, but they had flown military planes. And they said, "Wait a minute, we did that in World War II." And so a battle for recognition began. And it was a 5-year struggle. But at the end of that 5 years, a bill passed Congress recognizing the Wasp as veterans. Senator Barry Goldwater was instrumental in getting this passed. And why? Because he had ferried airplanes alongside the Wasp during that war, and he knew that they deserved to be recognized. So he really helped them fight that. And then President Jimmy Carter signed that bill into law in 1977. And then in 2010, our ladies received the Congressional Gold Medal. They were the third group to be honored in this way. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first. The Navajo Code Talkers were the second. So in a ceremony in Washington, D.C., President Obama awarded the Congressional Medal to the Women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II on March 10th, 2010. So the museum, as I mentioned earlier, opened its doors in 2005. It was actually started by a Wasp by the name of Deanie Parrish and her daughter, Nancy Parrish. They actually came to Sweetwater and talked to key local leaders and said, "We think it's time that the city had something to commemorate its history." And so the leaders agreed, and a committee was put together, and it was set in motion to become a museum. Now, we are not funded, nor ever have been funded by any local, state, or federal government. So this is goes completely off private donations. But let's see, 5 years ago, we went through an expansion thanks to a lot of fundraising efforts. You'll see the old hangar on the left side and the new on the right side. We built that hangar and just got the outside and part of the inside done, as you can see here. But this year we were able to complete the interior, and we added an archive, a boardroom, a catering kitchen, and of course a gift shop. And then we have some good exhibits in there as well. And then the original hangar is now being used to house 3 airworthy aircraft. So we have a UC-78, a BT-13, and a Stearman. So the next frontier for us is fundraising for all new exhibits that will really tell the story in a much more comprehensive way. And not only are we telling the Wasp story, but we're also preserving history of their legacy. So here in the center, you'll see Thunderbird uniform, and that belongs to Caroline Jensen, who was the second female Thunderbird. And so she's donated that to us. We got to unveil that at our fly-in last month, and she had her 12-year-old son with her, and he didn't know that it was going to be up there. And so he came around the corner and he saw his mother's uniform, and he was like, "Oh, Mom, you are in a museum." And it was just, our pleasure and our joy to be able to tell her story. So we hope that you will come and visit us at some point. We'd love to host you and show you around for yourselves. And of course, we do try to do things like this that brings the museum to you. And so we're constantly doing podcasts and things like that as well. So I think that is really what I have for you guys today.
Okay. Well, we have some questions. I have some
Yes.
questions, and some of our audience members have put some questions up as well. As we were talking about the history of the program itself, something struck me, and I just wanted clarification. Were all the Wasp trained in both single engine and multi-engine aircraft? I mean,
well, in the beginning, yes, absolutely. The UC-78 was the multi-engine, and that was the last plane that they flew. So they got 20 hours. As the program advanced, they dropped the UC-78 and found that the ladies came out trained just as effectively. But those earlier classes did get the twin engine.
okay. So they, and obviously the ones, the Wasp who did the ferrying could fly anything in the inventory.
It did. It was crazy. I have read accounts of where, they're looking at the owner's manual and they're flipping through it and kind of taxiing down the runway, and away they would go. But they didn't know from one day to the next what they were going to fly.
All right. Let's see. Were any of the Wasp married or mothers at the time that they were in the program?
They were. In fact, one of the 28 originals that started under Nancy Ludd, she had 3 children at home, like 10, 9, and 5. And she just had a tremendously supportive husband. But several of the women did have children. Some of them were married. Some of them went in because their husbands went in. Some of them were already widows. They had already lost their husbands. And so they went in just to kind of keep the fight going.
Okay. And because it was not a co-ed facility, then the families obviously were not able to be with their Wasp during their service then, at least during the training, correct?
Yes, during the training, but I have read accounts, like for instance, one of the Wasps that was married, she was married to a male pilot, and I've read accounts where he would come visit her, like on weekends occasionally, and they all loved it because a man was on the ground. So sure. I think there were those little exceptions, and families would come visit sometimes, but in terms of like male cadets there, stationed there, or spending any real time there, that's what didn't happen. So, and all the instructors were male, by the way. So go ahead.
Okay, and that leads to the next question. You mentioned the civilians that worked at Avenger Field. So were the instructors themselves military or civilian instructors, or a combination?
Both. They were both. So, for instance, I mentioned our Sandra Spears, our board director. Her father was an instructor. He owned an insurance company, but he knew how to fly, and he was an instructor. He knew how to instruct, and so he turned over his insurance business to her mother. And he went to go do that. So yeah, there was a lot of that.
Okay, and the same sort of thing for the mechanics. Was it a mixture, or was it all civilian?
It was a mixture, but mostly civilian, because it was the locals that they hired for the most part. So it was a lot of civilians that did the support roles.
It is interesting because it is sort of a pseudo military. You're talking about uniforms and calisthenics and the training that went to it to fly the Army way, as it were.
Yeah.
But yet, because they weren't officially recognized as being in the service, is sort of that limbo between the two. It must have been an interesting dynamic, especially for the leadership.
And it was, the girls, I've read accounts, they really complained that they were under all the military discipline.
Right.
If they stepped out of line, I mean, the military was going to discipline them, right? So they had all the burden and none of the perks,
Yeah.
so it was limbo. And you know, and I've wondered before, did they really hold that carrot over their heads of militarization? But I've gone to speak to enough living wasps now to know that, yeah, they really did. These ladies, they were led to believe this would happen.
Yeah. How many wasp are surviving today?
About 20, about 20. The youngest is 96 and she's in California. And then the oldest is over 100. And we have two that are turning 99 this month. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
I
amazing.
know. It's like all our military veterans, right? They're all aging. Yeah.
In your presentation, you mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt and the president, of course, but Eleanor kind of playing a role in helping to get the idea moving, similar to what she did with the Tuskegee Airmen. So she was really a very forward-thinking person.
She was amazing. We owe her a lot. I think as a country, we owe her a lot.
Let's see. Question about Fifinella. Did Disney ever do a short film on the Wasp, or was it just the insignia that had the Disney tie?
They never did a film. They actually, if you're familiar with Roald Dahl, who's wrote Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, he had written a book about Fifinella, and Disney created that little character, and they had plans to make a movie, but they never got clear rights between that estate and all that, so it never happened. And so she's just been a character all these years.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And you're still able to use her in conjunction with the Wasp and the Wasp Museum?
We do. Yeah, we do. They let us still use it.
So, and I guess the question is, did the women pilots outrank the male mechanics? But there really weren't any. There really wasn't any rank at Sweetwater, was there?
Not among the civilians, no, they didn't. So the question was, did the mechanics outrank the pilots? Is that what the question was?
Did the pilots outrank the mechanics?
Well, I think in status they did.
Okay.
Because I told the story of the female mechanic that was out there, and so she's still living, and she's like, "Oh, those wasps never talked to us. We were just the mechanic." So I think there's always rank, whether there's rank or not.
There we go. Let's see. Was there ever a Wasp shot down by enemy action? The viewer says, it seems I heard a story about such, but you also mentioned that the Wasp didn't fly outside the country.
They didn't. They didn't fly outside the country. They didn't fly in combat. I do from time to time have people bring me stories like that, but I always wonder if they have it confused with the British Air Transport Committee, because they did use women.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And this is going to lead me into our next topic anyway. Do the surviving members keep in touch with each other? And yes, they do. And you just had your annual homecoming celebration at Sweetwater at Adventure Field.
We did. So, first of all, the ladies formed a group back in the 70s, and they would have reunions in different towns and get together. I think when they won the battle for militarization, that really brought them together as a group. And so that got them going there, and they had their own reunions for a long time. And then they went on to form, to choose Texas Women's University as their official archive, and in 1985. And so there was a lot of contact between them for many, many years. And then when we started the museum, we started an annual event called Homecoming. So we would invite them home, right, to the field where they trained. And so that went on for 15 years. And the average attendance was about 30, because at that point in 2005, we had far less numbers, and they weren't as healthy. So 30 to 40 would come. In 2019, 2 came, and we don't expect to have them back on our field. We've had them virtually, thank goodness, but not on the field.
Yeah. Here's a good one. In your opinion, what's the best artifact or artifacts that are in the museum? Which ones fascinate you the most?
Oh, let's see. One of the things which I wouldn't have stopped to think about that fascinates me a lot are their letters. They were prolific letter writers and they kept every letter. And so we put on an exhibit, a special exhibit last year, and this woman had kept 350 postcards that she had sent back and forth. And so it's just like you're there, it transports you to a whole different time. So I love those. I love the airplanes. And honestly, I'm such a clothing girl. I love all the clothes we have in the museum. So
Were there any WASP of color in the program?
There were minorities. There were two women of Chinese American, they were Chinese American, and we had a Native American as well, and Hispanic. There were no Black pilots. They were, unfortunately, they were the only ones that were denied entry into the program, even though certainly there were qualified Black pilots. Yes.
All
So
right. The airplanes that you currently have on the field and are in airworthy condition, which are they again?
we have the UC-78, that's the twin engine. We have the Stearman, which is a primary trainer. And then we have the BT-13, the basic trainer. So. Did I lose you?
How often do the airplanes get out to fly?
Well, last year, 0,
Yeah.
but we take them to about 6 air shows a year. So we'll have the UC-78 at Oshkosh and Warbird Alley. So excited about that. And it'll be at the Silent Wings Museum this weekend in Lubbock. And then the BT-13 has several different events. We get to go to the 100th Bomb Group this year in Dallas. So, and we're going to post that on our website. So if you want to see one of our planes, you'll know where you can go to see it. Besides the museum, of course.
Of course. And do you have volunteers who fly the airplane or staff?
They are volunteers. We do. For the BT-13, I'm excited. We finally have a young woman who flies it, Jeanette Stone. She's 30, and so she fits that profile. It is not easy to find women who fly tail draggers. That's just, it's been tough. But we have another wonderfully qualified male pilot for the BT, and then the UC-78, another male pilot there. So we're fortunate.
Great. What's ahead for the museum? What do your future plans call for?
So we are fundraising steadily for new exhibits. We have good exhibits, but these are being done with a design firm out of Houston, and it's going to tell the story in a much more comprehensive way. So it'll be exhibits in both hangars and through the plaza. So we're excited for that. And then we're also, as we've expanded the mission to include legacy, we're so excited to start hosting aviation days and aviation camps for our youth. And so I'm projecting that we'll be doing that next summer. We'd like to really put these kiddos in contact with mentors, because as you know, you're a pilot, and if you don't have a direct connection right to flight, it's the probability that you're going to choose that as a career is fairly low. And there's a shortage of pilots, both in the military and in the commercial sectors. So we really hope to inspire some youth in some very tangible ways.
If folks want to find out more about the museum, your hours, most importantly, how to donate and support, what's the best way to do that?
So our website, waspmuseum.org. Pretty easy, waspmuseum.org. Yeah, find us, Google us, come see us. Yeah. So, yeah.
And for those who are not geographically, someone like me who's geographically challenged when it comes to the state of Texas being a very large state, where exactly do you find Sweetwater?
So if you know where Dallas is, right, you're just going to head west about 200 miles. So, and then if you know Abilene's pretty small, but we're 40 miles west of Abilene. So that's the easiest way. It's if you're going from Dallas and you're traveling to Colorado, New Mexico, you should stop because we're literally on the highway.
That's right. Yeah, I-20 is the main thoroughfare from east-west, and you're very close to. It's just an off ramp and a little jaunt out, and you're at Avenger Field.
Exactly. It's easy and it's pretty, especially with the torrential rain we've had. It's
Everything's in bloom for the next week or so, right?
it is. Hey, it's been
Yeah,
in bloom for about 3 weeks. I can't
that's
believe it.
great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we have a gorgeous wildflower crop.
excellent. Do you offer passenger flights at the museum or just demonstrations?
Yes, we don't offer passenger flights. As a nonprofit, we're not allowed to sell flights under any circumstances. Thank you, FAA and insurance company. So just demonstrations.
And in your opinion, why do you think there's still such a disproportionate number of male to female pilots uh, in the aviation world?
Yeah, I really think so much of it is lack of exposure. It's like what I was saying earlier. If you don't know someone in aviation, the chances are you're not going to make that, that decision. And so I think that young women just don't always get the exposure. I don't think they're always pushed in that direction. For instance, there's a 19-year-old young woman that I know in the Air Force Academy, and she said one day she kind of made this offhand remark, like, I think I'd like to fly. And her mother heard it. And all of a sudden, she was doing all kinds of research to push her and get her there. But the young lady, her name's London, and London said, had my mother not done that, I think it would have just sort of faded away and I would have gone a different direction. So I think mentors, I think people opening doors for you is huge. I don't think that there's barriers. I just think it's not a door we know to walk through.
Oh, and I agree. There's for so many years that it was, you had sort of certain stereotypes that you would look at in society, and a lot of that is gone, but it's still you kind of hit the point there, and that is that without a mentor, without someone to inspire you, if there's
Mhm.
because first of all, the pilot community is very small compared to the overall population. So the chances of you knowing someone who's a pilot is reduced, and unless, as in London's case, you have somebody in your family who sees that spark and helps you move through it, or you're introduced to a mentor or something, male or female these days, it can be difficult.
Absolutely. I think that it is. So yeah.
Let's see, is it going through the question list? You mentioned the fatty packs earlier, and
Yeah.
having to sit on two or three to be able to see out of the cockpit. But did the Wasp have any parachute training?
They did, not a lot. They did some, and honestly, a lot of them were very afraid to use them because everything was made for a man's frame. So those zoot suits you saw men size 44 long, and then those backpacks. One young lady, she was going to crash, and she refused to. She thought, I'm either gonna die landing this or whatever, but I'm not jumping out. And she managed to land it safely, but they did not like them.
Was there a common personality trait that you've seen among Wasp?
Bossy. They are very A-type. They are very commanding. I met a wasp in California about 18 months ago, and she's a lot older now, and her children were there, and I said, "Oh, your mom is precious." And they looked at me and they said, "Our mom is a lot of things, and precious is not one of them." I said, "Don't get us wrong, we love her, but she's tough. She's my way or the highway." And that's what I hear over and over again. I mean, they are large and in charge, and you'd have to be right to go push into the military in 1942. Like that wasn't going to be anyone that hung back.
So very true. Uh, in
Yeah.
the in the just couple of minutes that we have remaining, is there a story of a Wasp encounter or a story that you've heard about one of the Wasp that just sticks with you?
Mixed with me. Of course, the one I told earlier about Shirley, and just
Yeah.
she was there the day the program was deactivated. Um, that one always, that one always gets to me. There's another wasp too. Her name is Betty Strophus, and she's passed away, bright red hair, and she had a huge vigor for life, and she was of course, like everyone else, really disappointed that the program was disbanded. But she said, you know what? It's your job to go out and live your dreams. That's your job. So go figure it out. And she did that. She went out and she lived a really good life. And in her later years, she started going everywhere, and she became a speaker for the Wasp, right? She told the story over and over again, little bitty thing. And she told her daughter, she said, with her thick Minnesota accent, which I wish I could imitate desperately, she said, I intend to die with a microphone in my hand. And, she very nearly, I mean, she was just talking to the last minute. And it was just, I love that, crushing disappointment followed by a great life well lived.
Well, and I will have to say, in the years that I've been in aviation, I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of the Wasp, and they all have been just a delight, and all have great stories.
Yeah.
And I hope that you've been able to capture some of those in oral histories.
Some, not nearly as many as I would like, but we are working on it as best we can. We have a lot of good history there for sure. So, yep.
All right, in the just waning moments of our time here, any final thoughts that you have for our audience tonight?
Well, I'm just thankful that people still come and listen to their story, because I really do believe in its relevance today. I know that when I first learned about the Wasp story, I'm not a pilot. I don't have any kind of military background. And I was so struck by their story, because my thought was, what kind of person prepares for a career that they may or may not have? Like, I was shocked that they had their pilot's licenses before the war started. I couldn't believe it. And I thought about how I'm the kind of person that always walks on the safe side of the street. I don't take chances. I don't like to waste time. I want a sure bet. And these ladies taught me, right, posthumously, most of them, that if you don't try, I mean, you're really not going to go anywhere, right? It didn't work out perfectly for them, but they paved the way for every other woman that came after them. And that's what I encourage listeners today is read their stories and be inspired and ask yourself, what can I do differently in light of the fact of what they did?
Lisa, one more time, what's the website address for the Wasp Museum?
waspmuseum.org.
All right. Thanks again for joining us for another CAF Warbird 2 webinar. If you have any suggestions for future guests, good guests like Lisa, just let us know. I drop an email to Leah Block at media@cafhq.org. We'll be back next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock Central Time. Until then, thanks again to Lisa Taylor from the Wasp Museum for joining us tonight. I'm Steve Buss. Have a great evening.
Thanks.